The Middle Kingdom of Egypt is the period in the history of ancient Egypt between about 2000 BC and 1700 BC, stretching from the establishment of the 11th dynasty to the end of the 12th dynasty. Although some writers include the 13th and 14th dynasties in the Second Intermediate period. During this period, Osiris became the most important deity in popular religion. The period comprises two phases: the 11th dynasty, which ruled from Thebes, and the 12th dynasty onwards, which was centered on El-Lisht. These two dynasties were originally considered to be the full extent of this unified kingdom, but historians now consider the 13th dynasty to at least partially belong to the Middle Kingdom. Political history. Reunification. Under the 11th dynasty, after the collapse of the Old Kingdom, Egypt entered a period of weak pharaonic power and decentralization called the First Intermediate period. Towards the end of this period, two rival dynasties, known in Egyptology as the 10th and 11th, fought for power over the entire country. The Theban 11th dynasty only ruled southern Egypt from the First Cataract to the 10th nome of Upper Egypt. To the north, Lower Egypt was ruled by the rival 10th dynasty from Heracleopolis. The struggle was to be concluded by Mentuhotep II, who ascended the Theban throne in 2055 BC. During Mentuhotep II's 14th regnal year, he took advantage of a revolt in the Thinite nome to launch an attack on Heracleopolis, which met little resistance. After toppling the last rulers of the 10th dynasty, Mentuhotep began consolidating his power over all Egypt, a process which he finished by his 39th regnal year. For this reason, Mentuhotep II is regarded as the founder of the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep II commanded military campaigns south as far as the Second Cataract in Nubia, which had gained its independence during the First Intermediate period. He also restored Egyptian hegemony over the Sinai region, which had been lost to Egypt since the end of the Old Kingdom. To consolidate his authority, he restored the cult of the ruler, depicting himself as a god in his own lifetime. Wearing the headdresses of Amun and Min, he died after a reign of 51 years, and passed the throne to his son, Mentuhotep III. Mentuhotep III reigned for only 12 years, during which he continued consolidating Theban rule over the whole of Egypt, building a series of forts in the eastern delta region to secure Egypt against threats from Asia. He also sent the first expedition to Punt during the Middle Kingdom, by means of ships constructed at the end of Wadi Hammamet, on the Red Sea. Mentuhotep III was succeeded by Mentuhotep IV, whose name significantly is omitted from all ancient Egyptian king lists. The Turin Papyrus claims that after Mentuhotep III came 7 kingless years. Despite this absence, his reign is attested from a few inscriptions in Wadi Hammamet that record expeditions to the Red Sea coast and to quarry stone for the royal monuments. The leader of this expedition was his vizier Amenemhat, who was widely assumed to be the future pharaoh Amenemhat I, the first king of the 12th dynasty. Mentuhotep IV's absence from the king lists has prompted the theory that Amenemhat I usurped his throne. While there are no contemporary accounts of this struggle, certain circumstantial evidence may point to the existence of a civil war at the end of the 11th dynasty. Inscriptions left by one Neri, the Hatiye of Hermopolis, suggest that he was attacked at a place called Shedjet Shah by the forces of the reigning king, but his forces prevailed. Khnumhotep I, an official under Amenemhat I, claims to have participated in a flotilla of 20 ships to pacify Upper Egypt. Donald Redford has suggested these events should be interpreted as evidence of open war between two dynastic claimants. What is certain is that, however he came to power, Amenemhat I was not of royal birth. Early 12th dynasty. From the 12th dynasty onwards, pharaohs often kept well-trained standing armies, which included Nubian contingents. These formed the basis of larger forces which were raised for defense against invasion, or for expeditions up the Nile or across the Sinai. However, the Middle Kingdom was basically defensive in its military strategy, with fortifications built at the first cataract of the Nile, in the delta and across the Sinai Isthmus. Early in his reign, Amenemhet I was compelled to campaign in the Delta region, which had not received as much attention as Upper Egypt during the 11th dynasty. In addition, he strengthened defenses between Egypt and Asia, building the walls of the ruler in the East Delta region. Perhaps in response to this perpetual unrest, Amenemhet I built a new capital for Egypt in the north, known as Amenemhet Itj Tawi, or Amenemhet, Caesar of the Two Lands. The location of this capital is unknown, but is presumably near the city's necropolis, the present-day El-Lisht. Like Mentuhotep II, Amenemhet bolstered his claim to authority with propaganda. In particular, the prophecy of Nefertiti dates to about this time, which purports to be an oracle of an Old Kingdom priest, who predicts a king, Amenemhet I, arising from the far south of Egypt to restore the kingdom after centuries of chaos. Propaganda notwithstanding, Amenemhet never held the absolute power commanded in theory by the Old Kingdom pharaohs. During the first intermediate period, the governors of the nomes of Egypt, nomarchs, gained considerable power. Their posts had become hereditary, and some nomarchs entered into marriage alliances with the nomarchs of neighboring nomes. To strengthen his position, Amenemhet required registration of land, modified nome borders, and appointed nomarchs directly when offices became vacant, but acquiesced to the nomarch system, probably in order to placate the nomarchs who supported his rule. This gave the Middle Kingdom a more feudal organization than Egypt had before or would have afterward. In his 20th regnal year, Amenemhet established his son Senusret I as his co-regent, establishing a practice which would be used repeatedly throughout the rest of the Middle Kingdom and again during the new. In Amenemhet's 30th regnal year, he was presumably murdered in a palace conspiracy. Senusret, campaigning against Libyan invaders, rushed home to Ijtawi to prevent a takeover of the government. During his reign he continued the practice of directly appointing nomarchs, and undercut the autonomy of local priesthoods by building at cult centers throughout Egypt. Under his rule, Egyptian armies pushed south into Nubia as far as the Second Cataract, building a border fort at Buran and incorporating all of Lower Nubia as an Egyptian colony. To the west, he consolidated his power over the oases, and extended commercial contacts into Syrio-Palestine as far as Ugarit. In his 43rd regnal year, Senusret appointed Amenemhet II as junior co-regent, and died in his 46th. Among these records, preserved on temple walls at Tod and Memphis, are descriptions of peace treaties with certain Syrio-Palestinian cities, and military conflict with others. To the south, Amenemhet sent a campaign through Lower Nubia to inspect Wawit. It does not appear that Amenemhet continued his predecessor's policy of appointing nomarchs, but let it become hereditary again. Another expedition to Punt dates to his reign. In his 33rd regnal year, he appointed his son Senusret II co-regent. Evidence for military activity of any kind during the reign of Senusret II is non-existent. Senusret instead appears to have focused on domestic issues, particularly the irrigation of the Fayum. This multi-generational project aimed to convert the Fayum oasis into a productive swath of farmland. Senusret eventually placed his pyramid at the site of El Lahan, near the junction of the Nile and the Fayum's major irrigation canal, the Bar Youssef. He reigned only 15 years, which is evidenced by the incomplete nature of many of his constructions. His son, Senusret III, succeeded him. Height of the Middle Kingdom. Senusret III was a warrior king, often taking to the field himself. In his 6th year, he redredged an old kingdom canal around the first cataract to facilitate travel to Upper Nubia. He used this to launch a series of brutal campaigns in Nubia in his 6th, 8th, 10th, and 16th years. After his victories, Senusret built a series of massive forts throughout the country to establish the formal boundary between Egyptian conquest and unconquered Nubia at Semna. The personnel of these forts were charged to send frequent reports to the capital on the movements and activities of the local Medjay natives, some of which survive, revealing how tightly the Egyptians intended to control the southern border. Medjay were not allowed north of the border by ship, nor could they enter by land with their flocks, but they were permitted to travel to local forts in order to trade. After this, Senusret sent one more campaign in his 19th year, but turned back due to abnormally low Nile levels, which endangered his ships. One of Senusret's soldiers also records a campaign into Palestine, perhaps against Shechem, the only reference to a military campaign against a location in Palestine from the entirety of Middle Kingdom literature. Domestically, Senusret has been given credit for an administrative reform which put more power in the hands of appointees of the central government, instead of regional authorities. Egypt was divided into 3 wets, or administrative divisions: North, South, and Head of the South. Each region was administrated by a reporter, second reporter, some kind of council, and a staff of minor officials and scribes. The power of the nomarchs seems to drop off permanently during his reign, which has been taken to indicate that the central government had finally suppressed them, though there is no record that Senusret ever took direct action against them. Senusret III had a lasting legacy as a warrior pharaoh. His name was Hellenized by later Greek historians as Sesostris, a name which was then given to a conflation of Senusret and several New Kingdom warrior pharaohs. In Nubia, Senusret was worshipped as a patron god by Egyptian settlers. The duration of his reign remains something of an open question. His son Amenemhet III began reigning after Senusret's 19th regnal year, which has been widely considered Senusret's highest attested date. However, a reference to a year 39 on a fragment found in the construction debris of Senusret's mortuary temple has suggested the possibility of a long co-regency with his son. The reign of Amenemhat III was the height of Middle Kingdom economic prosperity. His reign is remarkable for the degree to which Egypt exploited its resources. Mining camps in the Sinai, which had previously been used only by intermittent expeditions, were operated on a semi-permanent basis, as evidenced by the construction of houses, walls, and even local cemeteries. There are 25 separate references to mining expeditions in the Sinai, and 4 to expeditions in Wadi Hammamet, one of which had over 2,000 workers. Amenemhet reinforced his father's defences in Nubia and continued the pharaoh land reclamation system. After a reign of 45 years, Amenemhet III was succeeded by Amenemhet IV, whose 9-year reign is poorly attested. Clearly by this time, dynastic power began to weaken, for which several explanations have been proposed. Contemporary records of the Nile flood levels indicate that the end of the reign of Amenemhet III was dry, and crop failures may have helped to destabilize the dynasty. Further, Amenemhet III had an inordinately long reign, which tends to create succession problems. The latter argument perhaps explains why Amenemhet IV was succeeded by Soberneferu, the first historically attested female king of Egypt. Soberneferu ruled no more than 4 years, and as she apparently had no heirs, when she died the 12th dynasty came to a sudden end, as did the golden age of the Middle Kingdom. Decline into the second intermediate period after the death of Soberneferu, the throne may have passed to Sekhemrekut Hawi Soberkotep, though in older studies Wegoff, who had previously been the great overseer of troops, was thought to have reigned next. Beginning with this reign, Egypt was ruled by a series of ephemeral kings for about 10 to 15 years. Ancient Egyptian sources regard these as the first kings of the 13th dynasty, though the term dynasty is misleading, as most kings of the 13th dynasty were not related. The names of these short-lived kings are attested on a few monuments and graffiti, and their succession order is only known from the Turin canon, although even this is not fully trusted. After the initial dynastic chaos, a series of longer reigning, better attested kings ruled for about 50 to 80 years. The strongest king of this period, Neferhotep I, ruled for 11 years and maintained effective control of Upper Egypt, Nubia, and the Delta, with the possible exceptions of Xois and Avaris. Neferhotep I was even recognized as the suzerain of the ruler of Byblos, indicating that the 13th dynasty was able to retain much of the power of the 12th dynasty, at least up to his reign. At some point during the 13th dynasty, Xois and Avaris began governing themselves, the rulers of Xois being the 14th dynasty, and the Asiatic rulers of Avaris being the Hyksos of the 15th dynasty. According to Manethor, this latter revolt occurred during the reign of Neferhotep's successor, Sobekotep IV, though there is no archaeological evidence. Sobekotep IV was succeeded by the short reign of Sobekotep V, who was followed by Wahiberi-Birau, then Merneferi. Wahiberi-Birau ruled 10 years, and Merneferi ruled for 23 years, the longest of any 13th dynasty king. But neither of these two kings left as many attestations as either Neferhotep or Sobekotep IV. Despite this, they both seem to have held at least parts of Lower Egypt. After Merneferi, however, no king left his name on any object found outside the south. This begins the final portion of the 13th dynasty, when southern kings continue to reign over Upper Egypt. But when the unity of Egypt fully disintegrated, the Middle Kingdom gave way to the Second Intermediate Period, administration. When the 11th dynasty reunified Egypt, it had to create a centralized administration such as had not existed in Egypt since the downfall of the Old Kingdom government. To do this, it appointed people to positions which had fallen out of use in the decentralized First Intermediate Period. Highest among these was the vizier. The vizier was the chief minister for the king, handling all the day-to-day business of government in the king's place. This was a monumental task, therefore it would often be split into two positions, a vizier of the north, and a vizier of the south. It is uncertain how often this occurred during the Middle Kingdom, but Senusret I clearly had two simultaneously functioning viziers. Other positions were inherited from the provincial form of government at Thebes used by the 11th dynasty before the reunification of Egypt. The overseer of sealed goods became the country's treasurer, and the overseer of the estate became the king's chief steward. These three positions and the scribe of the royal document, probably the king's personal scribe, appear to be the most important posts of the central government, judging by the monument count of those in these positions. Beside this, many Old Kingdom posts which had lost their original meaning and become mere honorifics were brought back into the central government. Only high-ranking officials could claim the title member of the elite, which had been applied liberally during the First Intermediate Period. This basic form of administration continued throughout the Middle Kingdom, though there is some evidence for a major reform of the central government under Senusret III. Records from his reign indicate that Upper and Lower Egypt were divided into separate waratum governed by separate administrators. Administrative documents and private stela indicate a proliferation of new bureaucratic titles around this time, which have been taken as evidence of a larger central government. Governance of the royal residence was moved into a separate division of government. The military was placed under the control of a chief general. Provincial government decentralization during the First Intermediate Period left the individual Egyptian provinces, or nomes, under the control of powerful families who held the hereditary title of Great Chief of the Nome, or Nomarch. This position developed during the 5th and 6th dynasties. When the various powers of Old Kingdom provincial officials began to be exercised by a single individual, at roughly this time, the provincial aristocracy began building elaborate tombs for themselves, which have been taken as evidence of the wealth and power which these rulers had acquired as nomarchs. By the end of the First Intermediate Period, some nomarchs ruled their nomes as minor potentates, such as the nomarch Neri of Hermopolis, who dated inscriptions by his own regnal year. When the 11th dynasty came to power, it was necessary to subdue the power of the nomarchs if Egypt was to be reunified under a central government. The first major steps towards that end took place under Amenemhet I. Amenemhet made the city, not the nome, the center of administration, and only the hatiye, or mayor, of the larger cities would be permitted to carry the title of nomarch. The title of nomarch continued to be used until the reign of Senusret III, as did the elaborate tombs indicative of their power, after which they suddenly disappear. This has been interpreted several ways. Traditionally, it has been believed that Senusret III took some action to suppress the nomarch families during his reign. Recently, other interpretations have been proposed. Detlef Frank has argued that Senusret II adopted a policy of educating the sons of nomarchs in the capital and appointing them to government posts. In this way, many provincial families may have been bled dry of scions. Also, while the title of Great Overlord of the Nome disappeared, other distinctive titles of the nomarchs remained. During the First Intermediate Period, individuals holding the title of Great Overlord also often held the title of Overseer of Priests. In the late Middle Kingdom, there exist families holding the titles of Mayor and Overseer of Priests as hereditary possessions. Therefore, it has been argued that the great nomarch families were never subdued, but were simply absorbed into the pharaonic administration of the country. While it is true that the large tombs indicative of nomarchs disappear at the end of the 12th dynasty, grand royal tombs also disappear soon thereafter due to general instability surrounding the decline of the Middle Kingdom.